For joining us. I'm gonna just wait another minute or two and let some people trickle in. All right, and let's get started. So welcome to Preservation North Carolina Shelter Series. My name is Julianne Patterson, and I'm Preservation North Carolina's Outreach Manager. Our Shelter Series is virtual programming that allows us to connect with preservationists and historians across the state on a variety of topics. Several of our programs this year, including this program, focus on stories or themes that relate to a traveling exhibit we debuted earlier this year called We Built This, that profiles Black architects and builders in North Carolina. The exhibit is currently on display at the Bellamy Mansion Museum in Wilmington, as well as the Pack Library in Asheville. They'll be there through the fall and then traveling on to other locations across the state. So you can find out more information about the exhibit and future events on our website, preservationnc.org. The Shelter Series has always been free of charge, and we plan to keep it that way, but I wanted to extend a huge thank you to those that added a donation to your registration today. It's greatly appreciated, and it helps us keep these programs going. Because this is a webinar, we can't see or hear you, but we know you're there, so thank you for joining us, and we still want to answer your questions, especially today, which is a different kind of format than our Shelter Series in the past, is more of an interactive kind of book club Shelter Series. So we are really reliant on your participation today. So please ask questions at any time using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can even start putting them in now if you want. If you have them ready to go ahead and put them in, and we'll get to them shortly. So first, I want to introduce today's presenter, author Kianna Alexander, who's joining us to talk about her book, Carolina Built, the story of Josephine N. Leary. So Kianna Alexander wears many hats. She's a doting mother, advice dispensing sister, and voracious reader. The author of more than 40 novels, although I was told as we were waiting for you all that she already has another one out, so I think it's up to 41. And she currently lives in her home state of North Carolina. So the book that we're here to talk about today is Carolina Built. And so just the synopsis of this book, if you haven't had it yet, hopefully many of you purchased it from Flyleaf Books, which I believe the discount through Flyleaf is available even through today, if you want to use the link on our website. But the book is about Josephine N. Leary. And so the synopsis off the back, I'll just read a brief little excerpt. So Josephine Leary is determined to build a life of her own and a future for her family. When she moves to Edenton, North Carolina from the plantation where she was born, she's free, newly married, and ready to follow her dreams. As the demands of life pull Josephine's attention away, it becomes increasingly difficult for her to pursue her real estate aspirations. She finds herself immersed in deepening her marriage, mothering her daughters, and being a dutiful daughter and granddaughter. Still, she manages to teach herself to be a businesswoman, to manage her finances, and to make smart investments in the local real estate market. But with each passing year, it grows more and more difficult to focus on building her legacy from the ground up. So as I said, I'll moderate all questions after Ms. Alexander goes through a brief presentation about Josephine Leary and kind of the process of writing the book. But if you have any technical questions, if you're having difficulty, go ahead and put those in the chat and I'll do my best to help. So with that, I'm gonna hand it off to Kianna Alexander.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kianna Alexander. Thank you so much for participating and coming to learn about someone who's become near and dear to my heart, who is Mrs. Josephine Napoleon Williams Leary. I'm going to just give you a little bit of background information about myself, about Mrs. Leary, and about the process of writing the book. So here we go. So that's me. Hi, I'm Kianna. I've published a lot of books. I think at this point, when the last one came out, July 19th, I think that was number 43. I will have number 44 come out in October, number 45 next spring. I'm a North Carolina native, born and raised in Durham. I went to St. Augustine's when it was still St. Augustine's College as an education major. But after I left, I started to pursue publishing instead of going into teaching. And I published my first book in 2009. It's been 13 years. My first book came out on August 29th. So it's been just over the 13-year mark for me in the publishing business. So here's how this whole thing kicked off. This is the infamous tweet that, if you've read the book, is mentioned in my author's note. I went back to my Twitter account to like screen grab it to put it here. So this was the first time in my whole life, even as a native North Carolinian, that I ever heard of Josephine Leary, when I just happened to be scrolling on Twitter and saw this tweet. So this was about 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago. And I was following Sarah for a long time. At the time, she was just the one I was following. I follow a lot of industry people on Twitter. That's the main reason I joined. And but she was not my agent at the time. I just followed her because I followed so many people in the industry. And I was like, oh, this looks really interesting. I'm a history nerd at heart. And so even though I screen capped just the tweet, what you can't see is underneath it, me saying, I will write it. I'll do it. Like basically me volunteering to write this book once I started to learn about what Mrs. Leary had accomplished. So fast forward about 2.5-ish years from that tweet, and Carolina Built, which you see the cover up there, was published on the 22nd of February this year. It's had a lot of positive attention from different publications, both nationally and locally. But the thing that was most special for me was being at Edenton on release day and receiving a proclamation from Edenton's mayor declaring February 22nd, Josephine Leary Day in Edenton. And I think that it was emotional for me. I cried a little bit. I really wanted people to know who she was, what she accomplished. And this was sort of a way of writing her name down in history the way I thought it should have always been. So it was really nice. It was really special for me to see, to be there, to see her get the recognition that I felt she deserved. So in the meantime, in the interim between the infamous tweet and the publication of the book, these are some of the things that I did to learn as much as I could about Mrs. Leary and her life and everything that was going on around the time that she was living. I went to Edenton because that was where most of the events that I had to portray in the story took place. It's where she lived most of her adult life. I wanted to see the places she saw, walk the streets that she walked, and really get a feel for the history in person. And then I visited Duke, where I was able to go through her papers, where they're held there. So I went and registered as a researcher, went into the archives in person and did the whole thing, checked in, and had them supervise me while I rifled through all these documents, photographs, deeds, contracts, all kinds of things written in her own hand, that I was able to sort of absorb even more information about her life. And then anything that I couldn't find in those two places, I searched online. And one of the best resources was the newspaper archives that the state of North Carolina keeps of their newspapers. The local newspapers around the area, around Edenton and around the surrounding counties, gave me a lot of information about not just things happening during the time in the state of North Carolina, but also about Mrs. Leary and her family and their personal life, because there was a paper called The Fisherman and Farmer, which is a Black newspaper in Edenton, and it had a section that looks in appearance something like you would see as a classifieds page. And instead of it being classified ads, they were basically like social announcements of things that were going on in town, such as there was one that said Clara Leary serenaded by local youth. And I took that one line and I turned it into a scene. So those sorts of resources were very helpful for me in the process of writing. So this is the lady herself. This is a portrait of Josephine taken when she was around the age of 30. She was born Josephine Napoleon Williams in 1856 in Williamston, North Carolina. We don't know exactly where, just somewhere in Williamston, She was owned by the Williams family, who are the namesake of the town. They owned several plantations. We do not know which one she was born on or the exact date. And we know that she passed away, unfortunately, on March 3rd of 1923 in Edenton of stomach cancer. So these are some of the things that Josephine was able to accomplish during her life, some of which you'll learn about in Carolina Built. As far as business, not only was she known for real estate, but she operated a barbershop, Central Barbershop on Broad Street with her husband. His name was Archer, but everyone called him Sweetie. Most people knew him by his nickname. And Josephine also built a real estate empire that included 6 properties. That's a mixture of land, residential property, and commercial property. Based on the information on the marker in front of the building, the J. and Leary Building that still stands today, if you valued all that property in the mid-2000s, it would have been at about $10 million in value, all of it together. So Josephine and Sweetie were married when she was the tender age of 17. She would go on to have 2 daughters, Clara and Florence, who was nicknamed Flory. There's no record of Florence having had children, though she did, as an adult, after college, marry a Chinese man. They lived here in the country for some years, and then they immigrated back to his homeland in the very early part of the 1900s. And Flory was never heard from again. We don't know what happened to her, if she had any children or anything like that. There's just no record of it. So I suppose it's possible that there could be Leary's remaining maybe in China. We just don't have record of that. Clara was married 3 times. And out of the course of those marriages, she only had 1 child. It was her son, Percival Reeves, nicknamed Percy. And he was the one in the 90s who decided to donate his grandmother's papers to Duke. He reached out to them because he thought that what she had left behind, that was just kind of sort of collecting dust in the attic, was of historical value, and he wanted to make sure that it would be preserved. So he was able to accomplish that before he passed away in 1994. So Percy and a grandniece of Mrs. Leary were the last 2 known members of the Leary family line. So you see there a picture of Percy as a young man. He was in his early 20s at the time. I was unable to find any images of Dr. Pelham, which was disappointing because she lived in contemporary times. But her name was Dr. Maureen Pelham, Dr. Maureen Pelham Johnson. She was the last known family member of Leary. She would have been the granddaughter of Josephine's younger brother, Octavius. She grew up to be a doctor, a medical doctor. She spent most of her career taking care of veterans, actually, around the VA hospitals in the DC area. Her obituary in the Washington Post talked a lot about her accomplishments in medicine. She had a lot of love and passion for the community, especially for taking care of veterans of various wars. So I feel like in many ways she was a kindred spirit of her aunt. She had a heart for the people. So those are that was some of the brief information I was able to find out about Dr. Pelham. This is the historical marker that sits on Broad Street today in Edenton. It's part of the Edenton Historic Trail. Rather than having a museum and a building, there's a trail in Edenton. And this is the number 14 marker. And it gives you sort of a timeline of Mrs. Leary's life and her accomplishments. And as you can see right there, the value of her holdings and her wealth in 2014, $10,700,000. So that's where I got that figure from in terms of the value of her real estate portfolio. So this marker gives a lot of information about her life. It has a little map there that marks out some of the places that she owned, places she worked and lived during her lifetime. So even though it's just a basic marker sitting on a sidewalk in front of a building, it gives a lot of information about her life. And I actually took this picture because I knew that I would be coming back to it in order to sort of take a look at things on a broad scale. And this is the J. and Leary Building as it appeared in January of 2021 when I visited. That is me in the trench coat there. Standing by the lamppost, and that's my assistant in the jeans. So we were that was one of the days that we spent in town, walking the streets and getting an idea of where things were. We had just passed 321 Broad Street, where her barbershop was. We went on foot around the town. We walked all day. I don't know how many, I probably did like 20,000 steps that day, but I wanted to see everything as she would have seen it. She wouldn't have been traveling in a car. So I walked just as she probably would have walked. And being able to see how much things have changed and how much they remain the same was really a good thing for me as part of my process of writing. I needed to see and touch and smell and experience things. And Edenton was a place that I had never visited. So I wanted to get as much of it, just absorb as much of it as I could, so that I would then be able to sit down at my desk and portray it, so that when readers read the book, they would feel like they had been there too. A fun fact about the barbershop, it's now occupied by another Black-owned business called Josephine Fashions. It's just like a little boutique where they sell like fancy clothes. If you're going to something at church, or you're going to a fancy event and you need kind of something with a little extra bling, and you need a hat, you need a purse. So that's the sort of vibe there. So it's still occupied by a Black-owned business, which I think is a good thing. So here's some themes that were my main focus in telling the story of Mrs. Leary's life. Perseverance and self-determination, obviously a big part of the story, because for her to live during the times that she lived, to have come from enslavement, poverty, and all sorts of things that were generally meant to hold her back, to rise to what she was able to accomplish, she would have to have those two things above all else. I also wanted to talk about marriage, family bonds, and legacy, how we view those things. Friendship dynamics across race, gender, and age groups. I found so much value in friendships with people who are both significantly younger than me and significantly older than me, and who come from different backgrounds, have different experiences. Sexism and the patriarchal expectations placed on women. And this is one of those things where I say a lot has changed, but a lot has remained the same. Racism, discrimination, and microaggressions were some things I also touched on in the book, as well as misogynoir, which is a specific kind of sexism that's perpetrated by Black men against Black women. And I also wanted to talk about the people behind me, sort of the wind beneath my wings, the people who helped me to get this thing done, to get this story out, that I thought was so important to tell. So the first picture there is Wendell Tabb. If you're a North Carolinian, you may already know his name and his face. He taught the drama program at Hillside High School for 35 years. He just retired this past spring. And he was my drama teacher in 9th grade. So this would have been 1996, 1997. I took his class as an elective. I really just wanted to sort of indulge in my own desire to tell stories. And I'm like, it's a drama class, so this should be fun. And it was. I wrote a 1-act play for him. And it was a time when it was the midterm. So everybody had to do the project. We had a cast from the class, all that. And he gave us free reign to write whatever type of play we wanted. And there were a lot of really serious topics. It was like suicide and AIDS and all these different really serious topics. And I wrote like this whimsical fantasy type play about a teenager going next door to borrow shore from her neighbor and finding out her neighbor's a witch. So I'm thinking, when I see all the other plays staged, I'm definitely going to fail. And he gave me an A. And he came up to me and he said very declaratively, "You are a writer." First time that anybody had ever said that to me, and was so sure of themselves. And that stuck in my mind all these years. And I still like talk to Mr. Tabb, like I have his cell phone number. He called me a few days ago, like, "Hey, I've got somebody that needs your help, working on a book. And I'm going to give you her number and I want you to call her." So we still talk to this day. He was hands down the best teacher I ever had. Something of a father figure to me and countless other students. But he's graduated a lot of brilliant people into different industries who've gone on to be educators, who've gone on to be actors, actresses, directors. And he's a great teacher, a great person. The middle picture is actually a really old picture. It's the only picture I have of my cousin Tanya, my late cousin Tanya. She's in the middle there, the diminutive figure between those two men. They are identical twins. The one in the baseball cap is my dad. That's my dad, Eric. And the one with the Jerry curl is his twin brother, my uncle Carl, who passed away a few years back. But in the middle is my cousin Tanya, who also passed away, unfortunately, in 2013. She was about 10 to 12 years older than me. When I was a young writer, fresh out of college, she gave me what Harper Lee's friends gave her. She gave me free room and board and a computer and an office, unlimited paper, unlimited time to write. And it was by her encouragement that I was able to finish my first manuscript that became my first published book in 2009. And I'm just happy that she lived to see it published and to see that it was dedicated to her. She was, Mr. Tab was the catalyst. She was the conduit. She pushed me toward finishing something that I thought I was just playing around with, that I may never have actually finished. She believed in my story. She was invested in my success, and she pushed me, and she gave me everything that I needed to be successful, to start my career. And every book that I write is in a way still dedicated in her memory. And then the other person is Sarah, my agent, the person who made that tweet and started me on the journey to this particular story. She has been an amazing advocate for me in an industry that is very, very hard to navigate as a Black woman. And I know that the success that I've had over the last few years is largely due to her effort and her tireless championing of my work and how passionate she is about it. So when I'm doing events like this, I try to bring attention to the people who helped me along the way, because nobody does this alone. There's always somebody who's behind you, somebody who gives you that little push. And then, of course, there's Beverly Jenkins. Anybody who hears me speak will hear me say Beverly Jenkins' name. She is my literary mama and my mentor. She's been with me since the beginning as well. I met her in 2008, and same thing with her. I have her cell phone number. I ask her questions about research, about marketing, about random things about life, about parenting, and she's always happy to answer. So shout out to the people who helped me do the thing. So that's basically the end of my presentation. I'm ready to take any questions that you all have.
Great. So I'll start out with a few of my. Can you hear me? Okay. I saw there was a comment that there was an echo, so I plugged in my headphones and my microphone. So hopefully that's helping a little bit. But so starting with that famous tweet that you saw, and I was so that's what really captured my attention about this whole story from the beginning, that it was something that, as I explained to you before we started this presentation, and doing all the research for the We Built This exhibit that PNC put out, finding all of these compelling but also underrepresented stories of these men in history that hadn't been told. And then here I'm reading this book and coming across this story of this Black woman who I'd never heard of before, who was doing the same thing that these men were doing. And even in a year of research, never came across her name. And talking with some of my coworkers that are familiar with her building, had been by it many, many times and always assumed it was a man's name up on the building. So I'm just curious, when you saw that tweet and you just got the little snippet of her story, what was it that really motivated you to look into her story? Was it the fact that, was it something about her and her story in particular, or just the fact that there are so many stories like this that haven't been told in history that need to be getting out there more?
Honestly, part of it was, like I said, that I'm a history nerd, and this sort of thing is like catnip for me. It only takes a little thing to spark my curiosity about something, and then I'm off down a rabbit hole on the internet. And I'm searching all the dark and dusty corners for everything I can find out about this thing that's now caught my attention. So some of it was that. Some of it, I think, was, I believe in sort of things being placed in front of you that are meant to guide you in a certain direction. Sort of the the hand of the ancestors. So I believe that also played a part in it, because I'm on Twitter all the time and there's so many tweets that I just scroll right on past without even seeing or stopping to read. But this one caught my attention. And knowing that she was someone who, as a Black woman, had done all these amazing things, and that I had spent my entire 8th grade year studying only North Carolina history for social studies and had never heard of her, it kind of irritated me just a little bit. Like, why don't I know this person? I feel like this is something that's important, that should be more well known. And so I always say, like, spite is valid motivation. So it was a little spiteful, because I was a little irritated that no one was talking about her, that this wasn't something that was already part of like the lexicon of North Carolina history. So I was like, well, I'm going to just have to take care of this myself. Obviously, I got to do it. And then it was pretty much off to the races for me. Like, I was very much hyperfixated. Like, I spent hours that day, like, just searching all over the internet. Where can I find more information about this person? And what you said about people passing by the building and thinking that J.N. Leary was a man, I had the same experience, because I went to the high school that's 2 blocks up the road from the building. And I spoke to high school students there. This was part of the like release day tour. I spoke to a lot of kids that day, a lot of English classes, history classes. And then in the afternoon, I spoke to kids that were at like the Boys and Girls Club. But at the high school, I heard the same thing, that students, they walk past the building, because some of them live beyond the building and they walk past it to get to school. And they assumed that J.N. Leary was a man. And I was the first person to tell them that, no, that was a woman, and a Black woman. And it's like, they literally go to school in the city directly next to the building, and they still didn't know. So I'm like, obviously there's way more work to be done in terms of like getting the word out. But there's so many stories like this of people doing these amazing, remarkable things, and nobody knows. It's lost to history. Sometimes it's lost by mistake. Sometimes it's lost on purpose. But I feel like either way, these are the kinds of stories that are like super important to tell.
Agreed. Well, and it's interesting too, because when I was first reading the book earlier this year and kind of talking with some of my family members who've been born and raised and grew up in North Carolina, and I was telling them like, oh my gosh, this phenomenal story. Some like people that are not, I mean, history is not their subject by any means, but I will never forget one of the people that I was talking to said, I didn't even know that a Black woman could own property at that point in time. And I was like, okay, if you have that mindset, think of how many other people probably have that mindset. And so I think just that fact alone is part of what makes the story so phenomenal. So, I mean, so she bought her first property at age 17, correct?
Yes.
And then,
her father was a man named Colonel William Lamb. He was a Confederate colonel. He was not someone affiliated with the Williams family, except that he was a friend of the family. He often visited the plantation. It's assumed that he was friends with one of the men in the Williams family, and that was how she was conceived on one of those visits to the plantation. This is a very common story. Colonel Lamb never acknowledged that Josephine was his child, other than 2 things: a painted portrait of himself that he had sent to her mother, and the $500 that he gave her as a wedding gift when he discovered she had married. And she used that money to make her first purchase.
And there's actually a question from Donna Macy, who was asking, would Jo have had the means to start had she had not gotten the seed money from her mother's owner, Jo's father? Or did I get those inferences wrong altogether? Granted, she built off of it, but did it bother her to have to use this money, meaning not doing it all on her own? Exactly.
Most likely not, because wages were so low for formerly enslaved people at the time. She probably would not have had, not in a lump sum. It would have taken her years to save up that amount of money. And I think from what I could tell from everything I read about her attitude was more like, she was like Beyonce, make lemonade. This money didn't come from the best possible source, but I can turn it into the best possible thing for my family going forward. And I think that was sort of the attitude that she had about it.
Well, and I mean, that's just interesting. Just hearing you speak about her is really interesting. So there are no living descendants, correct?
No.
And so, I mean, you taking on this story and writing about her based on like the primary sources that you find, I have to imagine that that just has to be a really hard task, kind of getting in her mind and thinking through her mindset and different things while you're writing. Can you speak a little bit about that and kind of how you...
It was definitely a spiritual experience for me. And I felt like that was one of the first things that I wanted to know when I first started looking at her life, was if she had any living descendants. And it took me a while to figure out that she didn't. But once I discovered that she didn't, then the first thing that came to my mind, well, this is a story that needs to be told, but there's no one left to tell it. If it's something that's left up to the family to tell, well, that ship has already sailed, but it's still worthy of being known. So then I felt even more compelled. Now it felt more like a duty that I needed to tell this story. And it was going to Edenton and walking instead of driving around to see things, to get perspective on how things look when you're standing on the road, to sort of experience Edenton, because there are things about a place that don't change. Architecture and things have changed around the building, but the building remains pretty much the same. They painted it to restore it to what they think it looked like during her time. But other than that, it's pretty much as it was. Because it's a steel front building, it's held up pretty well to time. It's brick. The front of that is steel that was like pressed in a factory and then brought in by train and hand painted. So it stood up pretty well to time. But like Water Street, and you can kind of smell that smell. Breeze is coming by. You can't communicate that unless it's hard to communicate that sort of thing, at least for me as a writer, without experiencing it. So to go down there, try the local food, see the sights, feel, hear, engage all my senses in the town, and just basically be there the way that she would have been there during her lifetime was really important as part of the process. And just reading the documents and things that she left behind and reading newspaper articles and stuff, and just sort of trying to put myself in her shoes as a woman of that time. How would I have felt about this? And so much of it was tied to my own experience, because you have somebody juggling several businesses with marriage and motherhood. And that was all something that I could relate to. So there was sort of a kinship there. As time passed and I read more about her, there were things that she didn't have because technology wasn't where it is now. But a lot of our experiences would have been similar just because we're both Black women in the South, raising families and running businesses, trying to navigate a society that isn't necessarily built for us or friendly to us. And so it started to become very much a feeling of kinship and sisterhood, that I felt that we had a lot more in common than I would have initially thought, despite like the gap in time between her existence and mine.
Well, thinking about that perspective and how you say you got into her mind, I found it interesting that you shifted perspectives between writing like a chapter from her perspective and then another chapter would be from her husband's perspective. What was the motivation for shifting back and forth between that, both kind of like as a stylistic writing style, but also like, did you do that to convey certain things? Just, I'd love to hear more about that.
That was something that I came up with like in conjunction with my editor. We're trying to give like a dual perspective, because there are conversations that happen between Sweetie and Josephine, and most of the time I only see her perspective, but we're trying to give what his perspective was probably like. There's a lot less information left about Sweetie than there is about Josephine and the rest of the family. There are no pictures of him or images or anything like that. Everything that we know about Sweetie is sort of like oral tradition, what's passed down, what people have said about him, and the things that were written in the newspaper, that sort of thing. It's all kind of secondhand. So it was a way to sort of give him more of a voice, since there wasn't a lot of information left about who he was as a person. So a lot of it is sort of conjecture about what a man of his time would likely have thought, based on like the little bit of information that I had about the things that occurred during his life and during his marriage to Josephine. We know that he came from Petersburg, Virginia, that he was also previously enslaved. He was likely mixed race, probably what they used to call quadroon or octoroon, and that he was like either 1/4 or 1/8 Black, so he was very fair skinned, and that's just based on like what was said about him. Since we don't have any images of him, we can't be absolutely sure. But if you look at images of Clara, and you can see kind of there's some resemblance to Josephine, but there's another set of features that's present that obviously came from Sweetie. So it was kind of a way to give him a voice and to kind of deepen the narrative so that readers could see that even though he came across a certain way to Josephine, he had very much his own way of thinking about things. And a lot of that was influenced by his peers and the times that he lived in. And that was sort of a statement on patriarchy and how it affects men and in ways they don't even realize. The sort of like testosterone peer pressure that sort of makes him say the things he says and act the way he acts when generally he would have defaulted to something else. So it was kind of to make a statement about that, and also to kind of give him a little bit more depth because there was so little information about him. And I wanted it to not be one-sided. I wanted this to be something that was like broadly understood, that even male readers could, that anybody could pick it up and be like, okay, there's something in here that is relatable to me. So I think that's how we ended up with the dual point of view. And it's not a lot of it. There's a lot more in Josephine's point of view than there is of his. I think he only has probably 3 or 4 scenes in his point of view, but I feel like they really helped to kind of deepen the story as a whole.
Well, that's what I was just going to say. I agree. It seems like whenever his perspective would come up, it was always like perfectly timed to like, what is he thinking?
Yeah.
And then there you go. You get it. So we have a question wanting to know, do you know what the buildings that she owned are now used today? I know you mentioned the barbershop and how that's used, but I actually don't know what the J.N. Leary building is used for these.
Okay, so I actually was able to go. I've been into it. I went to it and then I was inside of it when I went back for release day. Like when I went the first time to do the research and stuff, the building was locked. So I wasn't able to go inside until release day, which I was just like all of Twitter, like, oh my gosh, I get to see the inside. But it's really beautiful. The inside of it has also been well kept. There's 3 floors of the building. The lower floor is occupied by the Chowan Herald, which is the local newspaper. The upper 2 floors are private apartments. And I think they're also both occupied. So that's the way that when the building was built and all of that, it's always been a 3-story building and it's been used for various things over the years. But the Chowan Herald, I think, is like one of the longest running tenants. Okay. They've been in it for a while. And I was able to sort of talk to the reporters and stuff like that. So that's what happened to the building. It's still in use. The barbershop is still in use. There is a house on Freemason that's very near to Vine Oak Cemetery where Mrs. Leary and her family have a plot. That was Clara's home during the early 20th century. When Clara died, she passed it on to Percy, and Percy lived into it until he got sick and had to go into a facility. And that is still standing. It's Freemason and Granville, I think, the intersection where it's still standing. So that's sort of a family home. The house that Josephine lived in on Broad Street is no longer there. It fell into disrepair and it was demolished in the 1960s, and it's now occupied by an Exxon gas station. So that's not great. But there is another house that she owned that was originally at one intersection that has been picked up and moved to another intersection. And then there's a piece of land on Road Street in Elizabeth City. I haven't been to it, so I'm not sure what occupies it right now. It was just a plot of land at the time that she owned it. There was nothing on it, it was just land. So most of them still exist. Out of the 6 original properties, I think only 2 of them have been torn down or destroyed. And are in some kind of use. Like the 2 houses that are still standing are still, people still live in them. So for the most part, most of the portfolio survived. It no longer belongs to anybody related to her because there's nobody left from her family line. And when she was in her older age, nearing her death, there was no medical insurance at the time. So medical care was pay as you go. And she actually sold off all of her property in effort to pay her medical debt. And still wasn't able to cover it all. Clara actually took on a lot of that debt after she eventually passed away and was still left to pay a lot of it. But she was able to hang on to that house that she passed on to Percy. So even if there were living relatives, there's no telling whether or not it would still be in family hands just because of the illness that affected Josephine near the end of her life.
So another property that I was really interested in that you talk about in the book that she did not own, but just from a historical standpoint, the Badham School. So on East Gale Street, this reading in your book was the first time that I'd really read about that school, and I found a little bit of information online, but what else do you know about that school? And
the school is still there.
With the Badham family, but
yeah, the school is still there. I'm not sure that the family owns it, and I think that it's vacant. When I visited, it was vacant, but the school is still there. It's basically a 2-story house. The way it was built, the structure of it is like a 2-story house, and anybody from around the area will tell you that Badham houses have sort of a look to them. There's a lot of ornamental architectural details on the front, the red trim, these eaves and different things that are sort of hand carved and hand painted. So I've seen the building, and at the time that I saw it, it was still standing, but was vacant. When I returned to Edenton for release day, I actually met with a man named Carl Overton, who is the great grandson of Hannibal Badham, which I thought was extremely cool. And the reason that he is there is because his family had moved up to the Silver Spring, Maryland area. And he was recently retired. His wife had retired. And they decided that what they wanted to do was come back to Edenton to carry out his father's dream, which was to restore a particular house that was belonging to the Badham family that they called the wedding house, which was a gift from Hannibal to his son, Miles, who was the little baby born in the book when he married. The house is still standing, but in really bad disrepair, just from, the passage of time. And I was able to take a small brief tour of the front part of the house because it's still under construction. There are a lot of things that are kind of falling in on themselves, and we didn't want to, do anything too much to put ourselves in danger. But seeing a Badham house up close and seeing the detail, the outsides are beautiful, but the insides, I saw the fireplace had little 1-inch square tiles hand laid into it. They're like mother of pearl. Who does that? Nobody does that. It's intense detail and craftsmanship that you don't see. So what he wants to do is restore the house and turn it into a historic site. So that sort of thing, I'm sort of sad that there's no one left in the Leary family to do this sort of project. But knowing that the Badham line has continued and there are people that can come back and do this sort of product definitely made me feel better. So I'm fascinated by, I think they said there were 14 Badham houses still standing just in the town of Eden, and they built houses around the county. So it was really impressive to see it in person.
Yeah, they're definitely a stronghold of builders. And it's interesting to hear you talk about that house too, because another question that I had was, I think it's in chapter 7, when everybody's going to the party at the Badham house to meet the new baby Miles, the description of the house and everything inside it was so vivid. I was wondering where that it was so detailed, but I was like, this has to be true. Like there were so many times in reading that I was like, this is so descriptive that this has to be based in fact. And especially like the people that that were present at the party who you mentioned by name, were those all things that you pulled from like other like newspaper excerpts, like you mentioned earlier about like the Fisher and the Farmer newspaper, or like where did you pull those scenes?
That was another house that I only got to see from the outside because it's also vacant, but not in good enough condition for people to go inside of it.
Okay.
So I described the outside of the house as the outside of the house is, and as it appeared during its heyday. The inside details, that all came from me and my knowledge of the Badham building style. So I know what types of details the Badhams like to use, and I use that to generate what would their house most likely have looked like on the inside, based on what I knew they did and the materials they had available. The people that populate the story are like 60-40 real people versus people that I made up. Like very few of the characters are like completely fictional. Ida and Izzy are fictional. Rosie is fictional. Her father is fictional. But if you look at the thing about the Fisherman and Farmer, was even the section that was actual advertisements was of help to me. Like Louis Ziegler, the cabinet maker / undertaker, real person. How do I know? He took out an ad in the Fisherman and Farmer advertising that you could come and get a casket or a cabinet made. So I used his name and I gave him an appearance and a personality, but he was a real person. The same thing with the man who owned Mr. Overton, who owned the general store. So a lot of the people that were in the story were real people based on everything that was available to me in the newspaper. That newspaper was one of my best research sources. So it gave me like a great jumping off point, not only just for names and, you know, careers for people around the town, but also for different scenes in the book. There are several scenes that came from Clara being serenaded. That was in the paper. Josephine going to visit her brother in Washington was in the paper. Clara going off to college was in the paper. Clara coming home from college was in the paper. All these things were like just little 1 or 2 sentences in the social section of the newspaper, which gave me all these little beats of their life. And that whole altercation that happened between Sweetie and Josephine, there was an arrest report in the newspaper. So that really happened. So all of those things were scenes generated from their real life. I filled in like as little as possible with my own imagination. I used as much as I could of what was actually available to me in like primary source material.
Okay. So an anonymous question is, so in all that research that you're doing and reading the newspapers, did you run across the name John Tyler Page in Edenton? This person says they were born into slavery in Edenton, a builder. His 1883 home is on East King Street, about 4 blocks from the Leary Building.
Oh, yeah. I did run across that name. And from what I remember, he was part of the Badham's crew. They had sort of a revolving group of men in town that they would use on different projects. So like if you were a painter and they needed something really interesting in painting, if they needed like detail work done, they knew who to go to. And I think that's how I came across his name.
Okay. Do you have like in your research, do you have a list of everybody that was like ever on their cruise? Because I'm just thinking I'd love to see that eventually. I don't,
because that was also where Dorsey came from. Dorsey also was a real person. Dorsey Stewart that married Jeanette, Josephine's mother, was a real person. And that was also how I found him. He worked with the Badhams. So that was how his name came up. And I was like reading about what the Badhams were doing, and then discovered going on down the line that, oh, they got married. Oh, that's her father-in-law. I didn't even know. So that's how this whole thing, like, it was like you're looking for one thing and you find something else, and it ends up working its way into the story. But there were a lot more skilled craftsmen around Edenton and the surrounding areas, like Black people, than people would probably have thought. There were like expert painters, tile layers, people who could like carve you like anything out of wood, carpenters, like amazing talent. And when you look at these structures and see how they've held up I mean, you know, a strong storm comes along and blows away a house that was just built last year. But these houses have been standing in the same spot for 200 years. That's craftsmanship, right? That's skill.
Oh yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what we preach 24/7. So
Yeah.
it's nice to hear people also singing the praises of those buildings. But we have a question. I think you already said, so her friend Rosie in the story, you made that character up.
Yeah,
right?
she was fictional.
Okay. Because this person wanted to know if she finally married and if she had any descendants who may have known Joe and her family, but she was fictional. So in terms of other people who, it sounds like you talked to a Badham descendant, were there any other descendants of other people that were associated with the Learys who you came across?
Not that the Badham family probably took up the most real estate in terms of like other families that I know were like a big part of the Leary's lives. There were really a lot of other families that I found that kind of played that same kind of role. But there was another person who was real and prominent in town, and that was C.W. Ray. He was a real person that she mortgaged her house from, that owned the theater. All those things came from the newspaper. Give me like 1 second.
Okay. Well, everyone, this is your last opportunity to put questions into the Q&A box if you have them.
I'm like, of course the dog would pick now to like have some kind of conniption fit.
So one more question that I wanted to ask was, what was the most surprising thing that you found out about her in all of the research that you did? Was there anything that just stood out that was just surprising, or the most fascinating? First, what was the most surprising thing?
When I first started out, I didn't realize that that she had married so young, and that she had immediately turned around and started buying property right then. I was kind of thrown by that, because I was like, when I was 17, ain't no way. Like, I wasn't thinking nothing like that at 17. Yeah. She was she was thinking so far ahead and already planning at such a young age. I was really amazed by that. I think just knowing that everything that happened to her leading up to the conception of this building, there were so many points at which she could have quit that it would definitely have been the easier choice to just be like, I'm going to pack it in. I'm going to stop. Even if she kept working at the barbershop, like, she could have like quit with the real estate stuff at any time, because there were so many things going on, so many factors at play, and so many things that were kind of demanding her attention. The fact that she even kept going, like, that was the thing that got me the most when I read about the Cheapside fire and like the devastation. I saw like maps of what the town looked like before and after the fire, and so much of that block was destroyed. And it was, I just couldn't imagine, like, that's really like starting over from the beginning, like really starting over from the beginning. She had to make a choice. Like, am I really going to start over this late in the game, or am I just going to quit? So I was amazed by the fact that she continued, like, because I don't know that I would have. I don't know that a lot of people would have kept going in the face of so much disappointment. I'm really impressed with it.
Yeah, well, and especially, I mean, just given the fact that, I mean, she must have truly had like a business oriented mind, because as you said, starting so early at 17, and then she just seemed to continuously know the next right move. Even losing buildings in the fire, she still made the decision to rebuild. And I mean, yes, that must have been a huge risk to take. But I also just wanted to touch on, I know you talked about the different themes that you incorporated into the book, and I really liked the balance between like the motherhood and career balance, and especially putting that in the context of over 100 years ago, and kind of that mindset, because I think it's so easy to think about that as more of a modern day conundrum, and just having it from that perspective was really interesting. And it's cool to now see her building and know the story behind her.
It's really been it's very much one of those things where some things change and some things remain the same.
Mhm.
There's so little difference in a lot of ways between attitudes about women, what women are supposed to be doing now and then. Like, what are we even doing? It's basically the same.
Yeah.
The difference is only the technology. Like, she would have been bent over a washboard and we're loading stuff into, you know, a Samsung washer. It's basically the same vibe though. That's the same expectation that that's what we're supposed to be doing.
Yep. Well, thank you so much. If anybody else has any other questions, this is your last opportunity. And Kianna, I don't know if you have anything else to say before we go, but I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this, and really loved the book.
Thank you so much. I'm just glad that she's becoming known and that people are getting to learn about all the things that she accomplished. And I really hope that people find it inspiring. If you can think of all the things that she had to overcome to do what she did, that maybe it would help push people towards whatever the thing is they're meant to do.
I love that. And I want to know, are there any other like North Carolina historic figures who you are planning to write books about in the future?
Yes, there are a bunch that I'm really interested in, mainly being Hiram Revels, okay, who grew up in Fayetteville and went on to become the first African-American senator, taking the seat that was vacated when Jefferson Davis left it to become president of the Confederacy. And he doesn't even have so much as a bust here. And I think that's wrong. Charlotte Hawkins Brown, the educator, really interested in Anna Julia Cooper. So there are a lot of other people, even just from the state of North Carolina, that I'm interested in writing about. I'm interested in finding out more about the Badham family because there's still so much information about them. Pauli Murray. So there are a lot of people that I want to sort of explore the inner workings of their lives and their accomplishments that I feel like haven't really gotten their due.
Cool. Well, I look forward to seeing the next book.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Bye.
Bye.